You ever have one of those days where a letter in the mail flips your whole mood? That was me, standing by my gate, coffee in hand. When I opened this official-looking envelope from the HOA, it was a violation. Notice apparently, my fence was unauthorized and out of compliance with neighborhood standards. I almost laughed, but then I remembered these folks were serious. They weren't just suggesting I take the fence down. They were threatening fines if I didn't remove it by the end of the month. Now here's the kicker. That fence. It doesn't just sit on the edge of a small yard like most homes here. That fence marks the boundary of my 600-acre ranch. 600 acres that have been in my family for 3 generations. We're talking livestock, horses, hayfields, and even a natural spring that runs along the backstretch. And yet, somehow, this HOA formed just a few years ago when developers started building up the nearby subdivision. Thought they had jurisdiction over my property line at first. I figured it had to be a mistake. Maybe someone new on the board didn't realize where the actual neighborhood ends. So, I reached out, thinking a simple conversation would clear everything up, but instead of backing off, they doubled down. Said the fence was unsightly, too tall, and not approved by the architectural committee. I couldn't believe it. It quickly became clear that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Someone had an issue with my land. Maybe it was envy, maybe control, or maybe they just didn't like looking at anything that wasn't part of their manicured world. But what they didn't know was this. I had documents, land records, and boundaries recorded decades before their HOA even existed. That's when I realized, this wasn't going to be a quiet back and forth. It was about to turn into something much bigger. Because if they were going to come after my fence, they were about to find out exactly what stands behind it. So I drove down to the HOA office that same afternoon, thinking I'd just clear the air face to face. It's a small brick building tucked between a nail salon and a dry cleaner. Not exactly the kind of place you'd expect to be issuing threats over land rights. I walked in, fence photos and land plats in hand, and introduced myself. The receptionist gave me this tight smile, like she already knew who I was. A few minutes later, a man named Carl, the HOA president, came out to meet me. Carl looked like the type who took his role a little too seriously. Buttoned-up shirt, clipboard in hand, and a tone that felt more like a lecture than a conversation. I tried to explain that the fence had been standing long before any of these new homes were built, that it wasn't some decorative fence, it marked the legal boundary of a working ranch. But he barely let me get a word in. He kept referencing their community guidelines, talking about uniformity and curb appeal like my place was just another house on a cul-de-sac. I reminded him politely at first that my ranch wasn't even technically part of the HOA. The original property lines predated their association. I had deeds, surveys, even old aerial photos to back it up. But instead of reconsidering, Carl got defensive. He said, "Well, your fence still faces our neighborhood, and it needs to comply." That's when it really hit me. They weren't backing off because they thought they were right. They just didn't want a ranch fence ruining the view. For the folks who paid top dollar for their brand new homes, the tension kept rising. And something about Carl's tone told me this wasn't going to be solved with paperwork alone. Someone had stirred the pot, and now the HOA was digging in their heels. I walked out of that office knowing this wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about control. And they had no idea who they were messing with. Over the next week, things went from irritating to downright bizarre. First, I started getting notices left on my gate. Not mailed physically taped to the post like some kind of warning. One said my fence was a hazard. Another claimed it lowered property values. It was clear the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were trying to push buttons. And it wasn't just the fence anymore. They mentioned excessive animal noise, which I can only assume was my cattle lowing at sunrise. It was all so ridiculous. I almost didn't take it seriously. Almost, but then a neighbor from the edge of the subdivision stopped by. Older guy named Dennis. He came by with a coffee thermos and said, "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but you've got folks on that board who've been eyeing your land for a while now?" I asked what he meant, and he told me there'd been talk at a recent HOA meeting about how valuable it would be if the ranch land bordering the homes was sold off or redeveloped. His words, not mine. Now that got my attention, because suddenly it wasn't about some wooden fence or paint color. It was about pressure, about making life difficult until someone gave up and sold. And the deeper I looked, the more it added up. New builds were going up fast, property prices climbing. My ranch, it stood right in the middle of their picture-perfect plans. Meanwhile, I found out one of the newer board members, Susan, was a real estate agent who just happened to be advertising land with potential. Her listings, you guessed it, properties right up against my fence line. I started seeing signs of her office popping up everywhere, like she was already counting on me folding. But that's the part they didn't understand. My roots ran deep here. And this land wasn't just dirt, it was legacy. Every move they made just added fuel to the fire. I wasn't going to back down, but I also knew they weren't finished yet. By the third week, it felt like a full-on campaign. HOA board members were now doing drive-bys real slow, like they were taking notes or waiting for me to slip up. I even spotted one of them taking pictures of my barn from the road. I walked up to ask what she was doing, but she jumped in her SUV and sped off like I'd caught her red-handed. That's when I started keeping a journal, writing down every interaction, saving every letter, taking my own photos. Something told me I'd need proof soon. Then things escalated. One morning, I woke up to find a section of my fence had been cut clean through, like someone took bolt cutters to it in the middle of the night. The cattle were safe, thank God, but that wasn't the point. It wasn't nature or old wood. It was deliberate. The cut was clean, and the wire was tossed like trash a few feet into my pasture. That shook me more than I let on. Not because of the damage, but because now it felt personal. I called the sheriff's office and filed a report, though I could tell they didn't want to get in the middle of a civil matter. Still, they agreed to patrol the area more often, just in case. Meanwhile, I installed trail cams along the fence line. I wasn't about to sit back and wait for the next move. Then came the letter that nearly pushed me over the edge of formal notice from the HOA stating they would begin assessing daily fines if I didn't bring the property into compliance. They even included a schedule. The tone was smug, like they were daring me to challenge them. But what they didn't know was that I'd already been working behind the scenes. I had a meeting lined up with a land use attorney, and I was gathering old county records that proved my property had never been under their jurisdiction. I was quiet, but I wasn't idle. The pressure was building, and everyone could feel it. Something was about to give these that HOA was going to back down, ... Or we were heading straight into a legal showdown. Just when I thought I had a grip on things, the real twist came, one I never saw coming. A letter from the county showed up, marked urgent. At first, I assumed it was about the fence, maybe something the HOA filed to stir up more trouble. But it wasn't that at all. It was a notice of review. Apparently, someone had filed a petition requesting the county reevaluate the zoning classification of my land. And not just any zoning change, they were pushing for a reclassification that could limit agricultural use and open the door for future residential development. I stared at the paper for a long time. It had to be a mistake. My ranch had always been zoned for agriculture, grazing, farming, equestrian use. That zoning was what protected us from being swallowed up by suburbia. If that changed, I could be forced to follow new land use rules. Even worse, I might lose the right to keep my livestock or build new barns without county permits. The filing, It came from a citizens group called Community Forward Planning Committee. Sounded innocent, even official. But when I did a little digging, it turned out to be a shell group created just 3 months ago. The listed members, 2 HOA board members, including Susan, the same real estate agent with listings butting up to my ranch. That's when it hit. Me. This wasn't just a petty fight over fences or views. This was a coordinated effort to force my hand to use bureaucracy as a weapon and corner me into selling. They were thinking long-term, playing chess while I thought we were still arguing. About fence height, I brought everything to my attorney. He leaned back in his chair and said, "They're not trying to fine you. They're trying to flip your land." And suddenly, the fence was just a distraction. The real battle had always been about the ranch, about hundreds of acres that stood between them and the next wave of homes. And if they were willing to go this far in secret, what else were they planning next? The hearing day finally came. I walked into that county building with my boots still muddy from the morning feed and a binder full of records, maps, and legal opinions. My attorney was right beside me, calm but sharp. Across the room sat Susan, Carl, and a couple of other board members whispering among themselves like this was just another HOA meeting. They clearly thought they had it in the bag, but they didn't count on the paper trail I brought. When my name was called, I stepped up and laid everything out. I showed the original land survey from 1968, the agricultural tax status documents, and a statement from a former county zoning official who remembered my grandfather registering the property as a working ranch. Then we handed over photos, aerial maps, and proof that the so-called citizens group was really just a front created by HOA insiders to sway zoning for their own financial gain. The room got real quiet when that part came out, and just when I thought things couldn't get any better, my neighbor Dennis stood up from the back row. Hadn't even known he was there. Turns out, he brought his own documentation minutes from a town hall 10 years back that clearly defined the HOA's boundaries, which ended a full 300 feet before my fence line. That sealed it. The county board didn't just deny the zoning. They launched an investigation into the petition itself for misrepresentation. Susan turned pale. Carl looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. The fines were dropped immediately, and the HOA was warned not to harass me or face legal action. I walked out feeling like the fight was finally over. But it wasn't, because a week later, I got a call. Not from the county, not from the HO, as this one was from a developer. He offered me a number for the ranch so high it didn't even sound real. Said he'd been watching things unfold. That's when I realized this fight might be done, but the game around this land, it was just getting started. I let the developer's voicemail sit for a while. I didn't call him back not because I wasn't tempted, but because I needed to think. After everything the HOA put me through, fines, sabotage, and shady petitions, I had to ask myself what really mattered. Was it the money, or was it the legacy? This land wasn't just where I lived. It was where I grew up, where my kids had learned to ride, where my father taught me how to fix a busted fence after a storm. You can't buy that kind of history. I ended up turning the offer down. Not because I'm against development, but because this ranch still has work to do. And I wasn't about to let a few board members with too much free time erase generations of sweat and dirt just to make way. For cookie-cutter homes, as for the HOA, they've gone quiet. The board had a few changes after the county's investigation, and Susan quietly removed her signs from the nearby properties. Carl resigned. I heard the new president is a lot more interested in actual community work than playing power games. Good for them. Dennis and I talk more often now. We've even started a little unofficial network of long-timers who help each other out when the HOA oversteps. Just neighbors looking out for neighbors, what a neighborhood should be. So yeah, the fence is still standing, stronger than ever. But now it means more than just property lines. It stands as a reminder that sometimes you've got to fight for what's yours, not out of anger, but out of respect for the ground beneath your boots. And if anyone else wants to challenge that line again, well, they'll be facing more than just a fence. They'll be facing the whole story behind it.